Hi, this is Dr. Mike, and I wanted to welcome you to this week in our discussion board of concerning the Loyalist Patriot divide in the early days of the American colonial times right before the Revolution. I think we don't think about these issues very often, and I think this week is really good for us to consider what it was like to be a person living in the colonies in North America, but preceding the Revolutionary War. We tend to read back onto history that these were Americans. They were not. That concept of identity is going to be a major one through the war, through after the war, and I think probably up until about the War of 1812, when they finally confront the British again and force them to leave the continent. And finally, they're going to get some measure of freedom. Before that, even after the Revolution, the British still were in the process of stirring up Native Americans to attack the colonies. They would impress sailors off of various ships if they had a British accent, which most of these folks were British. And so they did have British accents, would impress them into servitude on their other ships and take them away. And so they were just a general form of harassment. The American identity is going to develop going forward. And there's a lot of discussion about how that develops, but mainly because I think it develops from the frontier and from the West. Is going to be an ever increasing part of the American myth and mystique that is history. And there is a great deal of myth involved in American history, the way it is told. And so I think you think about that as we go forward. For this week, as we think about the Loyalists that were in the colonies, if you'll notice in your announcements, I have posted some numbers there for you to look at. And it was about 50-50, those in favor and those against going to war. But there were a good number of loyalists who were faithful to the British Army. And as I make the statement, those numbers that I give you, there was a time in which there were more loyalists, colonial loyalists, fighting with the British than General Washington had in his own army, which is quite phenomenal. So think about those things. And there's a large number of loyalists who will leave the country after the defeat of the British and either move to other British holdings like Canada or the West Indies, Bahamas area, or go back to England. And so these are very, very sensitive ideas, and they are held very closely, and people are offended by what's happening because they have been a part of the British Empire at that time, which is a growing concern, and they don't want to leave that for a backwoods colonial kind of environment. So think about that as you choose your sides. It's funny because many of you don't want to side with the Loyalists and understand their perspective, but it is very helpful for you to do that, to realize that there were two perspectives, and that the founding fathers who did the process of setting up the country were the elites. They weren't the regular, blue collar worker that we would think of. And so as you look at that, be sure that you come to terms with that. There's a lot of primary sources that we can look at and we could talk about in this battle. I am publishing quite often some things that maybe you didn't know about the 13 colonies that you haven't heard before, and I hope those things will be an incitement to you to want to read more, to learn more, to understand more about the founding days of our country. For instance, Benjamin Franklin actually technically wrote the first Declaration of Independence, and it was such an affront even to the other founding fathers, because remember, they're not really sold on leaving England well into the Revolutionary War. That doesn't become an issue until well past the start. So they did not go into the war thinking that they were going to leave and become a separate country. In fact, probably nothing was further from the truth at that point in time, but they did want representation, and they wanted the freedom to run businesses and do the things that they needed to do here in this country. England operated on a system called mercantilism, and mercantilism said that you kept your holdings in these other places for the purpose of supplying natural resources, and that the manufacture of those goods were done in the mother country, and then the mother country would sell those goods back to the colonies at a profit. And so that was one of the things that the settlers did not, or the colonists did not like, was that they weren't allowed to manufacture much of anything in the New World. There is a pretty huge black market where they're buying things, like they're bringing rum from the West Indies, and it circumvents the British taxation system. And so Britain is losing money on that. And so the black market is causing some problems. The other thing you have to realize is that the state of the British economy was not that good. The French and Indian War actually was a part of a much larger war, the 30 Years' War that England and France had been engaged in with each other in all their holdings. It was the First World War, technically. And so they were, both France and England were, economically depressed. They didn't have a lot of cash. And so the least that they could do would be to bring that war here to America. And that's what they fought in the French and Indian War. Very, very difficult to maintain supply lines for two countries and two very large armies, as they're here in the French, of course, in the Ohio Valley in the north. And so they will incorporate Native American mercenaries, if you will, to fight alongside them and take some of the expense and the weight off of having so many soldiers here. I do supply you some numbers about how many British soldiers there were at the beginning of the Revolution, how many were killed, how many fled. The numbers that were absolutely, deserting the army look really big, and I think that's really interesting that they would leave the army. The British, the American Patriots, or the colonial patriots, maybe a better term, they didn't fight according to the decorum of war that the British subscribed to, and the French, like you would fight in Europe, but they hid behind trees and behind walls. And the British called them cowards because they would not come out and fight like a man. The method of fighting the British and French were used to, where the two armies would go on the field. One army would fire a volley and you just stood there and took it. And while they were reloading, the second army would fire back. And so it was back and forth like that, with both armies totally exposed on the field, just taking volley after volley, until finally whoever was left standing would be the winners. The colonials could not win that way. They could not fight that way. And so they fought in a more, hidden means behind trees and walls. And really the British redcoats with their red uniforms were sitting ducks to the Patriots. But when you look at the numbers, you wonder how they were able to win. So I think it's really interesting to look at these numbers and to ask the questions that you're writing about this week, about what was the mindset of the Loyalists, what were the mindset of these colonials, how did they come to terms with fighting against one of the greatest nations on the earth. And the Native Americans are really involved because, for instance, the Cherokee had been friends with the British from their first foray into the New World. And they'd actually taken many Cherokee chiefs back to England to meet the king. They had seen the full scale of British Army, British Navy, and they were just amazed at the size of it. They sided with the British and they lost. And when the British lost, they lost because they survived in the middle ground between the colonials and the British, or the British and the French. And they got what they wanted from them by playing one off the other. And suddenly part of that middle ground just disappears. And the Native Americans are left here in the hands of these crazy American colonials. And then when the French leave, then they really do. The violence and the things that happen with the Native Americans will step up and will increase as we move forward in our study of this very interesting period. And of course, up through the Civil War, where the Native Americans again pick a wrong side. They're the worst picker of sides in history because they pick the British side, they lose. Many of them side with the Confederates in the Civil War. In fact, the last general standing in the Confederacy was a full-blooded Native American general. And they lose again. The federal government declares them in violation of treaty. And of course, they begin to force them to own reservations from that. So the Native Americans will lose again. It is a story from the Native American standpoint of losses all across the board. They never seem to be able to win. any traction whatsoever from 1828, when Andrew Jackson had them removed west of the Mississippi on. They never are able to kind of make any sense of things until these latter days, when they have gained a few rights by their use of the Supreme Court. These things will give you some things to think about as you read through the text this week. I am available. I'm very open to questions, comments, and look forward to hearing what you have to say about the video and what we're reading. Thank you so much.